It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. The Mark Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Mark is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Mark Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And thanks for tuning in on WHP 580 AM and iHeartRadio, and also on Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live. If you'd like to watch prior podcasts of the show or read any of my columns on Penn Live or take a look at some great merchandise we have, including our popular Right to Bear Arms muscle shirt and our top seller, the We're Glad You're Our Neighbor, Just Please Don't Kill Us t-shirts. We also have those in yard signs. You can check out the markscaringshow.com website. And welcome back to all of our listeners here. And welcome back to Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the comeback kid. After having his campaign really nearly written off by most pollsters and pundits, Uncle Joe came back and won the South Carolina primary decisively and then stormed into Super Tuesday, winning 10 of the 14 states. And he picked up big wins in North Carolina, Arkansas, Alabama, Tennessee, Minnesota, Maine, Massachusetts, Oklahoma, and Texas, among some others. Biden won 566 delegates relative to Senator Bernie Sanders, 501 delegates. And Real Clear Politics average polls has Joe Biden up by about 9.5% over Bernie Sanders nationally. So that'll be the topic of the Mark Scaringi Show today. We'll talk about the race between Crazy Bernie and Uncle Joe. Now, leading up to Joe Biden's triumph on Super Tuesday, he received some support from two of his former rivals who threw in the towel after being trounced by Joe Biden in South Carolina. You'll remember Mayor Pete Buttigieg, as the president likes to refer to Mayor Pete, and United States Senator Amy Klobuchar. They both dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden on the eve of Super Tuesday. And this consolidated the center lane for Joe Biden. Remember, there were several competitors there leading up to Super Tuesday who were kind of jockeying for position in the center or the moderate lane, even though really Joe Biden has become much more leftist and much more left-wing in this presidential campaign than he had been during his many terms in the United States Senate. He was always perceived back in the 90s and in the early 2000s as more of a moderate or establishment Democrat. But in this presidential nomination contest, he's veered way to the left. But for whatever it's worth, people refer to Biden as the moderate or the centrist. And on the left wing, we had Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren vying for those votes over there. Now, Biden got the boost on Super Tuesday, as you well know, because Mayor Pete and Amy Klobuchar dropped out of the races and supported Biden just in the nick of time. Elizabeth Warren, however, competing against Bernie Sanders for the left lane, she didn't. Much to the chagrin of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, she stayed in, and she lost big on Super Tuesday, but also ended up taking votes in that left lane away from Bernie Sanders. Warren came in third place in her home state of Massachusetts. That's the state that she currently represents in the United States Senate, and she also lost Oklahoma big. Oklahoma, the state of her birth, and that's where Elizabeth Warren draws out her ancestry into from the Cherokee Nation there. That's where the Cherokee existed for some time in our nation's history, and Elizabeth Warren falsely trying to portray herself as a Native American, as an Indian, a Cherokee, through most of her career And apparently voters not buying it in Oklahoma, and voters not supporting her in her home state of Massachusetts, where she's the incumbent United States senator. That's that is remarkable that she was not able to win at least even those two states. Now, Joe Biden is the delegate leader and the front runner in the Democratic presidential nomination now. He had the entire Democratic Party establishment, the entire Democratic donor base, and the mainstream media on his side and plowing the way forward for him through Super Tuesday, and they plowed right through Bernie Sanders and his left-wing Bernie bros on Super Tuesday. And the question is, will Bernie put up a fight for the nomination? Just a week ago, the nomination seemed like it was Bernie Sanders to lose. Sanders won the first three states that had primaries in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, and seemed like he was beginning to pull away from the rest of the pack, with Biden doing a terrible job in the debates and Biden having very little infrastructure in many of the Super Tuesday states. Biden was putting everything in his blue wall, or as I've referred to it, as his black wall in South Carolina, putting everything behind the black vote in South Carolina. And they really came through for him. They put Biden over the top in South Carolina in a big way, winning a resounding victory against the distant second-place finisher Bernie Sanders. And that just kind of put out the lights in the other campaigns, Buttigieg and Klobuchar, and then ultimately Senator Warren's also. Tom Steyer dropped out, and Tom Steyer perhaps could have had an argument for the center lane, being that he's a multi-billionaire, and the establishment probably would have been okay with Tom Steyer. So Joe Biden giving himself the nickname Comeback Kid, the same way President Clinton, remember in 1992, President Clinton gave himself the title Comeback Kid when he performed poorly in the opening primaries and caucuses and then came back strong. So we shall see how Joe Biden does from this day forward. He is the front runner now, according to an average of the polls, that Real Clear Politics average polls I mentioned earlier. And as I say, the question is, and I want to hear from my listeners, the question is now, will Bernie put up a fight? Will Bernie Sanders fight for this nomination? That's the big question. Or will he just roll over the way he rolled over in 2016 when Hillary Clinton, with the massive support of the Democratic National Committee and Democratic donors and the Democratic establishment across the country, according to some critics, stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders in 2016. According to President Trump, that's the way it happened. And Bernie Sanders back then rolled over and supported Hillary Clinton and campaigned hard for her in the fall. Of course, she lost to President Trump in 2016. But that's the question this time around. Will Bernie Sanders put up the fight to win this nomination? There are many pundits and political talking heads who say the race is not over, that Sanders has considerable support among the left-wing activists who are the most energetic and the most active and who are working the hardest at the grassroots level for Bernie Sanders. But does he have the fight in him? Let me know what you think. Call in 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. Or you can comment live on Harrisburg 100 or the other Facebook Live programs we have running. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. And this is the place where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. We're talking about the race for the Democratic presidential nomination. The man who wins the nomination will go on to face President Donald J. Trump in his re-election bid in 2020. Well, we're here in 2020. And actually, it'll be this fall. And the race is on. It is now Bernie versus Joe. Crazy Bernie versus Uncle Joe, as the president would characterize the race. And I'm putting the question to my listeners, and that is, does Bernie Sanders have what it takes to fight for this nomination? Is he going to put up his dukes and get right to it? And we'll take your phone calls and hear your thoughts. 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. I'll tell you my take, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. And that is, I don't think he does. I say no way. I say Bernie Sanders will not put up a fight to win this nomination. I think he'll do what he did in 2016, and that is he'll go gently into this good night. Bernie does not have the killer instinct that you need to win. In 2016, remember, after the DNC teamed up with Hillary Clinton to rig the process against him and deny him the nomination, he rolled over and played dead for Hillary. He then endorsed Hillary. Hillary Clinton's the woman who stole the nomination from him. Remember the Democratic National Committee woman, the chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. She had to resign in disgrace because of the release of the emails from the DNC, showed that the DNC was in cahoots with the Hillary Clinton campaign to deny Sanders the nomination. Sanders apparently wasn't bothered by that, and went on to endorse Hillary Clinton in the fall, went around the country campaigning for her. And so I'm gonna just guess that Bernie's gonna do the same thing this time around for Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders is a Marxist-Leninist, no question about that. He's also old, rich, and happy, and I think content. He's worth millions of dollars. He owns 3 homes. He's an ideologue, but he's not a revolutionary, and perhaps he doesn't want to give up all that he has, all that he's acquired by really taking it to Joe Biden. That means taking it to the establishment, taking it to the Democratic donors, taking it to anyone who's important in the Democratic Party. Apparently, Bernie Sanders doesn't want to do it. He doesn't have it. He doesn't have that killer instinct. And as I say, he is an ideologue, but he's not a real revolutionary. He's like one of those spoiled rich kids from way back in your college days in the college dorm, and you probably all can think of someone in your college career who was like this, staying up late at night in the dorm rooms, railing against the man, glorifying Che Guevara or Fidel Castro or what other socialist dictator of the moment was fashionable among the liberal left at the time, all while living a very comfortable life in college. Those men and women, they always were talking about revolution, but they would always sleep in late the next day and skip class because they would stay up too late talking about revolution, or maybe partying a little too much. So they really didn't mean it. It wasn't really a real part of their core being. They didn't really believe in revolution. They, like Bernie Sanders, more of what I would call a dilettante, a socialist dilettante. They're not the real deal, and thank God they're not the real deal. Bernie doesn't have that killer instinct like an actual Marxist-Leninist socialist. He's no Che, he's no Fidel, he's no Vladimir, he's no Benito, thank goodness. Those men use bullets and guns and machetes and knives to take power, to implement their socialist political agenda. So I think America may catch a break here, because in Bernie Sanders, we have a socialist in name only, and thank goodness for that. Bernie, he, to his credit, I will say, he has started to contrast himself from Biden. And if you look at Bernie's remarks on election eve on Super Tuesday, he did start to point out the contrast. He actually talked about Biden's record in a negative way. But he needs to do much more than that if he's going to take out this front runner in Joe Biden, who has the entire Democratic establishment, donor class, and media behind him. Bernie Sanders has got to toughen up. He's got to get tough. He's got to get fierce. He's got to get the eye of the tiger. He's got to get the killer instinct. He's got to try to take Biden out. Now, at his press conference on Super Tuesday, he did point out that Biden voted for the war in Iraq, and then Sanders will say, but I didn't. And Sanders talked about those bad trade deals that Joe Biden voted for when he was in the United States Senate and advocated for when he was vice president to Barack Obama. And Sanders will say that he didn't support those trade deals. This is kind of a compare and contrast. It's very soft. It's very easy. And then, of course, Sanders says that Biden wants to cut Social Security and Medicare. That's a real blast from the past. Cutting Social Security and Medicare. Remember when that phrase came out of the mouths of every single Democrat when talking about Republicans. And maybe, we'll see Bernie swing that hammer at Uncle Joe. But there's so much more that Bernie can use to really go after Joe Biden and kneecap Joe Biden. But I don't know that I don't think Bernie has what it takes to do it. Bernie, he has a problem with elderly voters, and they don't like him. Maybe that's why Bernie's trying to scare seniors by talking about Uncle Joe cutting Social Security and Medicare. But that's not going to do it. That's something that politicians accuse each other in every election, primary and general. That's par for the course. Every politician is going to accuse the other politician of cutting Social Security and Medicare. But if Bernie Sanders wants to win this nomination, he's got to get tough, and he's got to go right after Joe Biden. And Joe Biden has a 50-year career to choose from of not just all of the gaffes. I mean, there are gaffes galore in the history, in the present of Joe Biden. But it's Joe Biden's record during the 90s and the early 2000s when Joe Biden was a centrist, moderate Democrat supporting the establishment, with the Democratic establishment, which is almost indecipherable from the Republican establishment. This is where Bernie needs to really focus his efforts and sink his teeth into. Now, Bernie did say that Joe Biden supported the war in Iraq, but he's got to do so much more than that. Biden he cheered for the Iraq war, and he repeatedly lied about that record. He's on record saying, yes, I did oppose the war before it began. Well, that's not true. Joe Biden was for the war in Iraq from before it occurred, from the beginning of the war, and for a good period during the war. And why can't Bernie hit him hard with this? The strongest statement that Bernie Sanders could muster in one of the recent debates about Joe Biden's support for the war in Iraq, here's what Bernie Sanders said. He said, Joe and I listened to what George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Rumsfeld had to say. I thought they were lying. Joe saw things differently. That's it. That's the Sanders statement. Joe saw things differently, while Bernie was able to say that he thought Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld were lying. Now, pose the same issue to President Trump or then candidate Trump, and what will Trump say? Trump said George Bush was lying. The war in Iraq was a lie. The Republican establishment that supported George Bush, those officials in his administration, led by Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and others, they fabricated the weapons of mass destruction issue. It was a war launched upon a lie, and Donald Trump, as a candidate, had no hesitation in stating the truth. And he did that throughout his entire campaign, not just to kneecap Jeb Bush, who was the chief cheerleader for the Bush administration during the Republican presidential primary in 2016, not just to do that, but that was part of who Donald Trump was, and it fit into his worldview. It fit into his foreign policy that so many of these wars are started on trumped-up charges and fabrications and lies, and we ought not to get into them in the first place. Well, that's Trump. Trump is able to deliver an anti-war message in a strong way and blast his opponents who supported it, knocking them out of the race practically. And maybe we'll talk, if we have time, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about what Donald Trump did to Jeb Bush in the 2016 South Carolina primary on this issue. But where's Bernie Sanders? Joe Biden was a big cheerleader for the war in Iraq. Bernie Sanders should be nailing him on this. Well, let's talk a little bit about how Trump handled it. As I say, remember, Jeb was the Republican establishment candidate back in 2016, similar to the way Joe Biden is the Democratic establishment candidate in 2020. But Donald Trump was he was holding a flamethrower, and he was just going at the establishment. And remember, Jeb Bush was trounced in Iowa, trounced in New Hampshire, and staked his political comeback on South Carolina. But remember that South Carolina Republican debate when Jeb Bush ran into a Trumpian blowtorch. At that debate, Trump said the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake. That's some very clear language, and you can really get a good understanding of how then candidate Trump felt about the war. Trump said it took Jeb 5 days before his people told him what to say, and Jeb was going back and forth. And then candidate Trump said, obviously it was a mistake. They lied. They said there were weapons of mass destruction, and there were none. There were none, and they knew there were none. Now that's then candidate Donald Trump just blasting Jeb Bush, George W. Bush, and the Republican establishment. And remember, Jeb tried to respond by saying Trump, and insulting Trump, saying that while my brother George W. was building the security apparatus to keep us safe, Donald Trump was building a reality TV show. What does Trump say in response? Trump says, well, the World Trade Towers came down during your brother's reign. I mean, that is a devastating and factually correct counterpunch from then candidate Donald J. Trump in a Republican primary in one of those pro-military states in the country, South Carolina. Where's Bernie Sanders? Why can't Bernie put up the fight that Trump put up in 2016? We'll talk more about Bernie versus Joe when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Let's get back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're talking about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And the hot topic for today is Crazy Bernie versus Uncle Joe. Who's going to win the Democratic primary and presidential nomination for the right to go on to challenge President Donald J. Trump in his re-election effort this fall? And we're talking about whether or not Bernie Sanders has the killer instinct to go after Joe Biden hard, the way he needs to do, if he has any chance of salvaging his chances in this Democratic presidential primary. Bernie Sanders did very well in the first three primary and caucus states, seemed to be developing some real momentum, seemed to be the front runner at that time, had displaced Joe Biden, who, according to all of the national polls going back half a year or more, had been the front runner. Bernie Sanders, coming out of Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, seemed to knock Joe Biden off his perch and was poised to take this nomination. However, Joe Biden went into South Carolina. His black wall defended him, put him over the top in a massive electoral victory in South Carolina. And then Joe Biden got the support from the Democratic National Committee. Well, we don't know we don't know officially if it's the Democratic National Committee, but certainly the Democratic establishment. The former governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, in a long list of Democratic heavyweights, started to support openly Joe Biden after his big win in South Carolina. South Carolina Mayor Pete dropped out. Senator Amy Klobuchar dropped out, thus really leaving the center lane open for Joe Biden. Elizabeth Warren wouldn't at the time. She stayed in, even though she had no chance of winning any state in Super Tuesday. But she was taking votes away from Bernie. She certainly harmed Bernie in a couple of key states. So Joe Biden ends up the big winner in Super Tuesday. He's got the big mo, so to speak, at his back. He's starting now to raise big money once again, and he's looking very, very tough and probably insurmountable. But the question is whether or not Bernie Sanders is gonna fight this campaign the way he needs to fight it if he actually wants to win it. Or is Bernie Sanders just in it to make a point? Is Bernie Sanders just in it because this is what he does? This is what he's been doing for so much of his adult life, being the standard bearer for democratic socialism in America. Is this all this means to Bernie? Is just that he's there to hoist the flag and make it known what his policies and positions are and advance democratic socialism as well as he can, or does he want to actually win the nomination? And I have my doubts. He rolled over for Hillary Clinton in 2016 when she and the DNC teamed up to deny him the nomination, and I'm thinking that Bernie Sanders is going to do the same this time around. And we were giving an example earlier in the show about how then candidate Donald J. Trump, he had no qualms about kneecapping his primary rivals, and I was comparing then candidate Donald J. Trump really using the war in Iraq to go after Jeb Bush, who had to cheerlead for his brother George W. Bush, who was the president, two-term president, who led our country into war in Iraq, and how Trump had no qualms about kneecapping Jeb Bush with that disastrous decision, even in a Republican Party. And when it was the Republican Party that was in charge that led our country into that war. And Trump even did it in South Carolina, the most pro-military state in the country, with our massive naval bases down there. But Trump did it, and he did it very effectively. Where's Bernie? This is supposed to be one of Bernie's signature issues. And Joe Biden was a big cheerleader for the war in Iraq. Where's Bernie? I don't think he's going to put up or show up the way he needs to if he wants to defeat Joe Biden. Joe Biden has a long list of moderate, centrist, establishment type votes and decisions that he's made throughout his career that Bernie Sanders can have a field day with. How about the bankruptcy bill that Joe Biden championed through the United States Senate to make it harder for the poor to file for bankruptcy in America, making it difficult to file that Chapter 11 bankruptcy, kind of really pushing filers into Chapter 13 reorganizations. This was a bankruptcy reform act that was promoted by the credit card industry, by MBNA America, which was based at the time in Wilmington, Delaware, where Joe Biden was United States Senator, and where, by the way, Joe Biden's son Hunter, Hunter always shows up. Hunter always shows up in these issues and that Joe Biden is a champion of. Hunter Biden got a job at MBNA and was making over $100,000 a year as some sort of vice president, even though he had no prior experience in the credit or banking industries, working for MBNA, one of a big supporter of his father, Joe Biden, when he was in the United States Senate. So Biden runs the Bankruptcy Reform Act through the United States Senate, which protected creditors, made it harder for debtors to file for bankruptcy. And Bernie Sanders is the cheerleader and champion for the poor. Why is Bernie Sanders not taking that and using that as a cudgel to knock down Joe Biden as being a protector and champion for Wall Street, for the banking industry? Bernie Sanders loves to rail against big banking. He wants to break up the big banking industry like Elizabeth Warren does. Well, why doesn't Bernie Sanders really take it to Joe Biden? Because Joe Biden not only protected big banking, protected credit cards when he was in the credit card companies, when he was in the United States Senate by championing the Bankruptcy Reform Act, but Biden did it while his son Hunter was making hundreds of thousands of dollars from MBNA America, from the largest credit card company in the country at the time. How about NAFTA? Joe Biden was a big advocate of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, Donald Trump has no problem just lighting the hair on fire of any Republican who supported NAFTA. Where is Bernie Sanders in attacking Joe Biden who supported NAFTA? NAFTA has destroyed towns and cities across Pennsylvania and across most of the Midwest and the industrial states. Remember, H. Ross Perot talked about that giant sucking sound, that if we put NAFTA into effect, you're gonna hear that sucking sound where our jobs and factories are going to be sucked down into Mexico. where there's very, very low wages, very few environmental regulations, very few employment labor regulations, much easier for corporate America to shift their factories down there, pay Mexicans 50 cents on the dollar, and then ship the products back into America tariff-free. That's NAFTA. And that destroyed so many blue-collar jobs in Scranton, in Johnstown, in Altoona, across Pennsylvania and across the country. And Joe Biden says he's blue-collar Joe. He's Joe from Scranton. He supported NAFTA. He supported all of those free trade agreements. And where's Bernie Sanders? Bernie Sanders should be going after Joe Biden night and day on Biden's support for all these free trade agreements that have decimated blue-collar jobs throughout Pennsylvania and throughout our country. And there's so much more. How about Joe Biden being one of the chief sponsors of the 1994 crime bill that so many on the left deride as racist, as a crime bill that was designed to hurt, to incarcerate blacks? And Joe Biden is the champion of black America. Yet he was a big advocate of the crime bill that so many black leaders throughout our country derail as racist. Why isn't Sanders hanging that albatross around Biden's neck? Trump would. And in fact, Trump has on the crime bill. Trump has done a lot to undo the damage of that crime bill did to the black community, which is one of the reasons why I think Donald Trump is going to do so well with the black community in this general election that's rapidly approaching. But there's so much more that Bernie Sanders can do to take out Joe Biden, but I just don't see it. I don't think he's got it in him to do it. What do you think? Call in 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. Or you're welcome to comment live on Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live or any of the other Facebook programs we've got running now. So I just don't think Bernie has the chutzpah to go after Joe Biden for Biden's obvious weaknesses. And how about this? How about just taking Joe Biden today? I'm saying that Sanders should attack Joe Biden's record as United States Senator, but just take Joe Biden today. How about Joe Biden's mental capacity? How about Joe Biden does not have the mental capacity to be president of the United States? The whole country sees it. Anytime Joe Biden's on their television, he is frequently incoherent, confused, stuttering, mumbling, can't get a coherent sentence out. Joe Biden's 77 years old. He'll be 78 on Inauguration Day. Biden appears as if he's on the verge of being settled into the comforts of a nice nursing home. He recently confused his wife and his sister. He got them mixed up. He forgot the most famous sentence from the Declaration of Independence. He vowed he would win on Super Thursday when he meant Super Tuesday. There's so much more that Sanders could be leveling on Biden for his obvious mental incapacity, but he chooses not to do it. More on Bernie versus Joe Biden when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to the Mark Scaringi Show.
Now back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. And this is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And we're talking about Crazy Bernie versus Uncle Joe and who's going to win the Democratic presidential primary nomination to go on and challenge President Donald Trump in the re-election this fall. And we're talking about it from the perspective of whether or not Bernie has what it takes to take out Joe Biden, who is now very clearly the front runner for the Democratic presidential primary nomination. And before we get back into that, I just want to do a little public service announcement. Since we're talking about the Democratic primary contest, they'll have their convention in Milwaukee, where they will nominate their nominee to go on and challenge President Trump in the fall. We Republicans also have our own Republican National Convention in the summer. That'll be down in Charlotte, North Carolina. And yours truly is running as a delegate from the 10th Congressional District, along with Katie Moyer Isley, who is a running mate of mine, so to speak, for the position of delegate. You can vote for up to 3 delegates, and you'll see our names on the ballot in the Republican primary this fall if you're in the 10th Congressional District, April 28th. So it's coming up in just about 6 weeks from now. So you'll have a chance to vote for us for delegate, and if you do, you'll send us to Charlotte, North Carolina, to the Republican National Convention. Once there, we will certainly fight the good fight against any Republican establishment efforts to derail the Trump reelection bid, and we have other Trump delegates across Pennsylvania who are also running in their congressional districts. We've got a great one in the 7th Congressional District, and that's Gloria Lee Snover. You may know her. She's the Northampton County Republican chairwoman and a proud Trump supporter from day one. Back in 2016, she was endorsed by President Trump to be his delegate back then. And yes, she did hold, and she held the line for then-candidate Trump in Cleveland that summer, along with yours truly and others. So that's just a brief public service announcement. We'll talk more about the delegate race when we get a little bit closer. We're still about 6 weeks out. Right now, we're talking about the race between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, and how, in my opinion, I don't think Bernie is going to pull it out because he just doesn't seem to have the instinct. He just doesn't seem to want it that badly enough. Perhaps he's just very complacent, being a multi-millionaire Democratic Socialist with 3 homes. Who doesn't have a summer camp in Maine, by the way? And he likes to be kind of the professor who teaches us about the glories of Marxist-Leninism and how everything in Nicaragua and Cuba, things are great, and Fidel Castro was terrific with his literacy program when he took power in Cuba. And maybe in talking about the Green New Deal and Medicare for All, maybe that's what Bernie Sanders is. He's just kind of a lecturer. He's not someone who truly wants to do what it takes to win an election when he can actually put his ideas into policies that actually go into effect. You know, I think he's only had about 7 bills passed, and he's been in the Senate and Congress for a long, long time. But I think he's only had 7 bills passed, and maybe one of my listeners will correct me on that. And I believe one of those 7 bills was naming a post office in Vermont. And so really Bernie Sanders as a legislator never accomplished anything. He has talked a lot since the early 70s when he got into politics about the wonders of socialism and how it was going to transform America, but maybe he's all talk and no action. Joe Biden, on the other hand, has had his hand in many major pieces of legislation since he's been in the United States Senate. And we talked about the 1994 crime bill. We talked about NAFTA. We talked about the Bankruptcy Reform Act and others, where Joe Biden has been a leader in getting things passed in Washington, D.C. Bernie Sanders, he's not that way. And I'm reaching the conclusion he really doesn't want to win this race. Maybe he just wants to keep trying to make a point. But there's so much in Biden's history, both in the votes that he's made as a United States Senator and the actions, or not really actions as vice president. He just kind of goes along with what President Obama did to our country over those 8 years. There's so much there just in voting and in being vice president. And how about all of the Biden family corruption? How about all of that? How about Hunter Biden and his deals in Ukraine and in China? How about Hunter Biden getting paid $50,000 or $80,000 a month over 3 years, getting as a member of the board of governors of Burisma Natural Gas Company, which, by the way, is a polluter. I thought Bernie Sanders was against pollution, and wants to get us off oil, natural gas, and coal and onto green energy. Well, why isn't Bernie Sanders just really taking it to Joe Biden because of the Biden family corruption and Hunter Biden in China, getting that some billion-dollar equity fund when Biden had when Hunter Biden had no experience in equity, and Hunter Biden had no experience in natural gas or energy. How about Joe Biden's brother, James Biden? James Biden got an executive vice president job with a construction management company called Hill International, which is one of the largest in the world, despite having no construction experience. And just coincidentally, Hill International then got a $1.5 billion contract to construct housing in where? War-torn Iraq. Paid for by whom? Well, you and me, the taxpayers, of course. A $22 million construction project with the Department of State. The son of the founder of that company told investors at a private meeting that to have the brother of the vice president as a partner really helps get government contracts. Well, of course it does. So there's Biden family corruption in Iraq. And you have Joe Biden being a champion of the war in Iraq. We send our military over there, and our U.S. service members, they go into harm's way. It's a bloody battle. For what purpose? The premise upon which we went into the war turned out to be a lie, and they're getting their arms and legs blown off, and they're getting killed in Iraq, and our bombs and missiles are destroying a lot of the country. Well, then, of course, it needs to be rebuilt. Rebuilt by whom? Well, I guess the Biden family. The Biden family's over there. They're carpenters. They're setting up walls and building foundations. Well, not really. They're just executive VPs, and they're just getting paid to be a vice president of the construction company that actually does the construction. How about Frank Biden, Joe's older brother? He scored a big real estate development project in Costa Rica. When? Well, at the time that Barack Obama appointed Joe Biden as the point person in Costa Rica. Well, isn't that convenient? Joe Biden was appointed the point person in Ukraine by Barack Obama, and Hunter Biden gets a seat on the board of governors of its largest natural gas company and makes millions. By the way, I just read somewhere that Hunter Biden, the rent he's paying on his home in Hollywood is only $12,000 a month. And how many of you, I guess, is that a deal? I'm not so sure. His rent for his house in Hollywood, this is Hunter Biden, is only $12,000 a month. From his gig, where does he get the money? From China and Ukraine, because of the fact that his father was intimately involved in our foreign policy in those two countries. But I got sidetracked from Frank Biden. There are many Bidens, by the way, who have gotten just rich off the fact that their brother was vice president. So Frank Biden, he goes down to Costa Rica. His brother is vice president, the point person in U.S. foreign policy with Costa Rica. And despite no experience in real estate development, none whatsoever, Frank ends up developing a project to tear apart part of the jungle and put up a world-class country club casino project. That sounds rather Trumpian, doesn't it? But that was done by Biden family connections. And, of course, there's so much more to it with government loans and subsidies going down into those projects. But the Biden family got rich off their brother Joe Biden being vice president of the United States. Where is Bernie Sanders on taking down Biden for his obvious corruption? I guess he's not going to do it. He's going to roll over, and Joe Biden's going to win this nomination. But rest assured, my friends and listeners, there is a man who is going to take it to Joe Biden, and you know who that is. He's down there in the White House today, and or actually he might be on his way to Tennessee, but Donald J. Trump will take it to Joe Biden. He will do what needs to be done to take out this candidate and expose him for the corrupt politician that he is. and also expose the fact that he lacks the mental capacity and the mental faculties and abilities to be president of the United States, and that's Joe Biden, a man who can't put two words together in a sentence. He rarely has a coherent thought, and Donald Trump will take that to him and will take him out and will win re-election resoundingly. Bernie Sanders isn't going to do it. So it's going to be Biden versus Trump in the fall, and it's going to pave the way for a huge Trump landslide re-election. Well, that's all the time we had today. Thanks for listening to the Mark Scaringi Show. Tune in every Saturday at 1 p.m.